Marriage. It's supposed to be a partnership, a bond that grows stronger with time. At least, that's what I believed when I married Karen. We met in college, where she was the life of every party, and I was the guy who studied too hard. We balanced each other out. She brought me out of my shell, and I gave her stability. It worked well, until it didn't. We got married after graduation, settled down, and built a life together. I landed a good job in tech, and Karen, who had always been more outgoing, thrived in her sales career. We never had kids, something we both agreed on early in the relationship. We were happy, or so I thought. The first few years of marriage were great. We traveled, partied, and even bought our dream home. Karen was always the social butterfly, making friends everywhere she went. I didn't mind, if anything, I admired her for it. But somewhere along the line, that admiration turned into something else. The late nights out with her friends, the weekend business trips, and the sudden secrecy, it all started to add up. I pushed the doubts aside for a long time, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. But you can only ignore the signs for so long before they start screaming at you. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, with small changes that I couldn't quite put my finger on at first. Karen, who used to be so open and chatty, started guarding her phone like it held state secrets. She would turn it away from me when a message came in, or quickly flip it over so I couldn't see the screen. When I asked her about it, she'd laugh it off, calling me silly and overprotective. But there was something in her laugh that didn't sit right with me, something forced. Then there were the nights out with her friends. They became more frequent and stretched later into the night. At first, I didn't think much of it. Karen was always the social one, and I trusted her. But when she started coming home smelling like cologne that wasn't mine, my suspicions began to grow. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that it was just in my head. But deep down, I knew something was off. The first real crack in our marriage appeared one night when Karen came home particularly late. I was already in bed, pretending to be asleep when she stumbled into the room. I could smell the alcohol on her breath as she kissed my cheek, a weak attempt to hide whatever guilt she was feeling. As she undressed, I caught a glimpse of a lace bra I hadn't seen before, something far too sexy for a casual night out with friends. My stomach tightened, but I stayed silent, too afraid of the answers I might get if I asked the questions burning in my mind. The next morning, she was her usual bubbly self, acting as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Over the next few weeks, I started to notice more things, little details that, on their own, seemed innocent but together painted a disturbing picture. The sudden influx of new lingerie, the text messages she always seemed too eager to hide, and the way she started avoiding eye contact with me, it all pointed to one inevitable conclusion. I knew I needed to confront her, but I kept putting it off, hoping that it was all just a misunderstanding. But the final straw came one weekend when Karen told me she was going to a business conference out of town. She had these trips occasionally, so it wasn't unusual, but this time something felt different. She was too eager to leave, too quick to pack her bags and rush out the door. The moment she left, I felt an emptiness in our home that I couldn't ignore. That night, I sat alone in our living room, staring at the wedding photo on the mantel. We looked so happy, so full of hope for the future. But now, all I could see were the cracks, the lies, the deceit that had slowly crept into our lives. I couldn't sleep that night. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with the possibilities. Was I just being paranoid? Was there really something going on, or was I imagining things? The next morning, I decided to do something I never thought I would. I decided to check Karen's email. She had left her laptop at home, and I knew her password. I sat at the kitchen table, feeling like a complete asshole, but I had to know. I had to see if my suspicions were justified. My hands shook as I typed in her password, and for a moment, I hesitated. What if I found nothing? What if I was just going crazy? But what if I found something? I hit enter, and her inbox opened up. At first, it was all work emails, nothing suspicious. I almost breathed a sigh of relief until I noticed an email thread from someone named Tom. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, and there it was, my worst fears confirmed in black and white. The emails were explicit, the kind of thing you only send to someone you're intimately involved with. They had been going back and forth for months, discussing everything from their plans to meet up to what they wanted to do to each other in bed. It was like a punch to the gut. I sat there, staring at the screen, numb with shock. I couldn't believe what I was reading. My wife, the woman I had trusted with my life, was cheating on me. All the signs I had ignored, all the doubts I had pushed aside, came rushing back like a tidal wave. I felt like a fool, like the biggest idiot in the world. How could I have been so blind? I wanted to smash the laptop, to throw it across the room and pretend like none of it was real. But the evidence was right there in front of me, undeniable and devastating. I had to face the truth, I had to confront Karen. But how? How do you confront the person you love about something so vile, so destructive? I knew I couldn't do it over the phone. No, this was something that needed to be done face to face. I needed to see her reaction, to hear her excuses and lies. I needed to know how deep this betrayal went. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, my mind reeling from what I had discovered. By the time Karen got home, I was seething with anger, barely able to contain the storm brewing inside me. She walked in, smiling like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just spent the weekend with another man. I could feel my blood boiling, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. But I stayed calm, biding my time. I didn't want to explode, not yet. I needed to do this right, to get the full truth out of her before I made my move. How was the conference? I asked, forcing a smile. It was good, she replied casually, dropping her bags by the door. Exhausting, though. I'm glad to be home. She leaned in to kiss me, but I turned my head, letting her lips brush my cheek instead. She pulled back, looking puzzled. Everything okay? She asked, her voice tinged with concern. Yeah, I lied, just tired. I watched her carefully, looking for any sign that she knew what I knew. But she was a good actress, playing her role of the loving wife perfectly. It made me sick to my stomach. I couldn't keep up the charade for much longer, I needed answers. Later that night, after we had both gone to bed, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The sound of Karen's soft breathing beside me was almost too much to bear. How could she sleep so peacefully after what she had done? How could she lie there next to me, pretending like everything was fine? I knew I couldn't keep this inside any longer. Tomorrow, I would confront her. Tomorrow, I would get the truth, no matter how much it hurt. But as I lay there, anger simmering beneath the surface, a new thought began to take shape in my mind. Confronting her wasn't enough. She had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and she needed to pay for that. I wasn't going to let her walk away from this unscathed. She was going to feel the pain she had inflicted on me, tenfold. A plan began to form in my mind, one that would ensure Karen understood the full weight of her actions. She had shattered our marriage, and now, I was going to shatter her world. The plan was set in motion the next day. I had to get answers, and I had to see for myself just how deep Karen's betrayal ran. I needed to know if it was just Tom or if there were others. And if there were others, I would find them, too. I wasn't going to leave any stone unturned. My wife had made a fool of me, and now it was time to turn the tables. I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't focus on anything else. I called in sick and spent the morning tracking down everything I could find about Tom. He was easy to locate online, thanks to the details in the emails. He lived in the same city, just a few miles from where we lived, and had a profile picture that made me want to punch the screen. He looked smug, self-assured, like he had everything figured out. Little did he know, his world was about to come crashing down. By the afternoon, I had all the information I needed. I knew where he worked, what car he drove, and where he liked to spend his time. It was almost too easy. I felt a strange sense of calm as I went through the motions, like I was outside my own body, watching everything unfold from a distance. It was all part of the plan, my plan to expose Karen and make sure she paid for what she had done. I decided to follow her that evening. She was heading out again, claiming she had a work dinner to attend. I didn't let on that I knew what was really going on. I played the role of the clueless husband, giving her a quick kiss on the cheek before she left, just like any other night. But as soon as she was out the door, I grabbed my jacket, my phone, and my car keys, and followed her. Karen didn't go far, just a few miles across town. She pulled into a parking lot near a trendy little restaurant that she had mentioned once or twice in passing. I parked a few spaces away, careful to stay out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched her get out of the car, smooth down her dress, and walk inside. I waited for a few minutes before getting out of my car, keeping my distance as I approached the restaurant. I hung back near the entrance, pretending to be on my phone while I scanned the interior. It wasn't long before I spotted her, sitting at a table near the back, her back to me. And across from her, with a grin plastered on his face, was Tom. The sight of him made my blood boil, but I kept my cool. I couldn't afford to lose it, yet. I made my way around the restaurant, careful to stay out of their line of sight. They were deep in conversation, laughing and leaning in close to each other, oblivious to the world around them. It was disgusting to watch. I felt a sick sense of satisfaction knowing that I was about to blow their little bubble of infidelity wide open. After what felt like an eternity, Karen finally leaned across the table and kissed him. It wasn't just a peck on the lips, it was the kind of kiss that said more than words ever could. My hand tightened around my phone as I pressed record, capturing every second of it. I wanted evidence, proof that couldn't be denied or explained away. And this was it. They pulled apart, laughing softly, and that's when I decided to make my move. I walked up to their table, my footsteps heavy on the polished floor. They didn't notice me at first, too wrapped up in each other to realize they were about to get the shock of their lives. But as I got closer, Karen's eyes flicked up and met mine. The color drained from her face in an instant, her smile vanishing as she realized what was happening. "Jake, what are you doing here?" she stammered, her voice shaky. I didn't answer. Instead, I looked at Tom, who was staring at me with a mix of confusion and fear. He clearly hadn't expected this, hadn't expected me to show up and catch them in the act. He was a coward, just like I suspected. "Get up," I said, my voice low and controlled. It took every ounce of self-restraint I had not to launch myself across the table and knock him out then and there. "We're going to have a little talk." Tom hesitated, glancing at Karen as if she might somehow save him from what was coming. But she was just as terrified as he was, frozen in her seat, unable to do anything but watch as the scene unfolded. I said, "Get up." I barked, my patience running thin. He finally stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I grabbed him by the collar and yanked him away from the table, dragging him out of the restaurant. Karen started to follow, but I shot her a look that stopped her in her tracks. "Stay here," I ordered, my tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll deal with you later." Tom tried to resist as I hauled him outside, but he was no match for the fury that was coursing through my veins. Once we were out of sight, in a dark alley next to the restaurant, I let him go, shoving him hard against the wall. He stumbled, trying to regain his balance, but before he could say anything, I slammed my fist into his face. He let out a pained grunt, blood spurting from his nose as he crumpled to the ground. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I kicked him hard in the stomach, watching with grim satisfaction as he doubled over, gasping for air. He wasn't laughing now. He wasn't so smug anymore. "You think you can fuck my wife and get away with it?" I snarled, grabbing him by the collar and pulling him to his feet, only to slam him back against the wall. "You think you can come into my life, into my marriage, and just walk away unscathed?" He tried to speak, tried to beg for mercy, but I wasn't in the mood to hear his pathetic excuses. I punched him again, harder this time, feeling the satisfying crunch of bone beneath my knuckles. He cried out in pain, his hands coming up in a weak attempt to defend himself, but it was useless. He was no match for the anger that was driving me, the need to make him pay for what he had done. You think you're a big man, huh? Seducing another man's wife, fucking her behind my back? How does it feel now, huh? How does it feel to be on the receiving end? I wasn't sure how long I kept hitting him. Time seemed to blur as I took out all my rage and frustration on his pathetic form. It wasn't until he was slumped against the wall, barely conscious, that I finally stepped back, breathing heavily. My hands were bruised and bloody, but I felt a grim sense of satisfaction as I looked down at him. He wasn't laughing now. I leaned in close, making sure he could hear every word. If I ever see you near my wife again, I will fucking end you. Do you understand? He nodded weakly, blood dripping from his split lip, his eyes glazed with fear. He wasn't going to be a problem anymore. I straightened up, wiping the blood from my knuckles on his shirt before turning on my heel and walking away. I didn't look back. He wasn't worth my time anymore. As I made my way back to the restaurant, my mind was already shifting to the next step, the confrontation with Karen. She was the one who had betrayed me, the one who had shattered our marriage. And now, it was her turn to face the consequences. But as I walked back inside, the adrenaline started to wear off, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. I returned to the restaurant, my heart still pounding from the encounter in the alley. My mind was a chaotic mix of rage and disbelief. As I stepped back into the dimly lit room, I spotted Karen right where I'd left her, still sitting at the table, her hands trembling as she clutched her wine glass. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Jake," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't let her finish. I walked over to the table and slammed my hand down hard on the surface, making her jump. The few other patrons in the restaurant turned to look, but I didn't care. Let them watch. Let them see what a cheating wife looks like when she's caught in the act. "We're leaving," I growled, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her out of her chair. She stumbled, nearly dropping her glass, but I didn't wait for her to steady herself. I dragged her out of the restaurant, ignoring the concerned looks from the waitstaff and the other customers. Karen didn't resist, she didn't even try. She knew there was no point. The drive home was silent, the air between us thick with tension. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Karen sat beside me, staring straight ahead, her face pale and expressionless. I could feel the fear radiating off her, but I didn't care. She had brought this on herself. As we pulled into the driveway, I shut off the engine and sat there for a moment, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside me. But it was no use. I was too far gone, too angry, too hurt, too betrayed. I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Get inside," I said through gritted teeth, my voice barely controlled. Karen didn't argue. She got out of the car and walked to the front door, her steps unsteady. I followed her inside, slamming the door shut behind us. The sound echoed through the empty house, a sharp reminder of the confrontation that was about to take place. I watched as she slowly turned to face me, her eyes brimming with tears. But there was no sympathy in my heart, no pity for the woman who had lied to me, betrayed me, made a fool of me. All I felt was anger, pure, unadulterated rage. "You have one chance, Karen," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "One chance to tell me the truth. I know about Tom, and I know there's more. So start talking." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, she broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. I stood there, unmoved, watching her crumble under the weight of her guilt. It should have hurt to see her like this, but all I felt was satisfaction. She deserved every tear, every ounce of pain she was feeling. It was nothing compared to what she had put me through. "How long?" I demanded, my voice rising. "How long have you been fucking him behind my back?" Karen shook her head, trying to form words through her sobs. "It's not what you think, Jake, please, I can explain." Explain? Explain what, Karen? That you've been sneaking around with another man while I was working my ass off to give you everything you ever wanted? That you've been lying to my face, pretending everything was fine while you were off fucking someone else? It wasn't like that, she cried, her voice breaking. It was just. I was lonely, Jake. You were always working, always busy, and I. Don't you dare try to blame this on me, I snapped, cutting her off. Don't you dare. I was working to support us, to give us the life we always dreamed of. And this is how you repay me? By screwing around behind my back? She flinched at my words, fresh tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, Jake. I'm so sorry. Sorry? I echoed, laughing bitterly. Sorry doesn't even begin to cover it, Karen. You destroyed everything. Everything we had, everything we built together, it's all gone because you couldn't keep your legs closed. She sobbed harder, covering her face with her hands. I could see the shame in her eyes, the guilt eating away at her. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. How many? I demanded, my voice harsh. How many others were there? Was it just Tom, or were there more? Karen hesitated, her sobs slowing as she tried to collect herself. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the internal struggle as she debated whether or not to come clean. I wasn't going to make it easy for her. Don't lie to me, Karen, I warned, taking a step closer. I will find out. I've already found Tom, and I swear, if you lie to me now, I will make sure you regret it. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen. And then, finally, she broke. There were others, she whispered, her voice trembling. A few. I didn't mean for it to happen, Jake, I swear. A few? I repeated, my anger flaring. How many is a few, Karen? How many men did you let into our bed while I was working late? How many times did you betray me? I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely audible. 3, 4, maybe more. I lost count. Her words hit me like a sledgehammer, knocking the breath out of me. I had expected 1, maybe 2 affairs. But this? This was beyond anything I could have imagined. My vision blurred with rage, my hands shaking as I struggled to keep myself from losing control. You lost count? I hissed, my voice trembling with fury. You lost fucking count? Do you even hear yourself? Do you even realize what you're saying? She nodded weakly, more tears spilling from her eyes. I'm sorry, Jake. I was stupid, I was selfish. I didn't mean to hurt you. Didn't mean to hurt me? I repeated, incredulous. You didn't mean to hurt me? How the fuck do you think I feel right now, Karen? How do you think it feels to know that the woman I loved, the woman I married, has been whoring herself out to every guy who gave her the time of day? Karen's sobs grew louder, her whole body shaking with the force of her tears. But I couldn't stop. The anger, the betrayal, the overwhelming sense of loss, it all came pouring out, every word a dagger aimed straight at her heart. Do you even love me? I demanded, my voice breaking. Or was this all just a game to you? Was I just some idiot you kept around to pay the bills while you fucked whoever you wanted? No, she cried, shaking her head desperately. No, Jake, I love you, I do. I never stopped loving you. Loving me? I scoffed, my voice dripping with sarcasm. This is how you show love, Karen? By cheating on me, by lying to me, by destroying our marriage? That's love to you? It was a mistake, she pleaded, reaching out to me. A terrible, horrible mistake, but I never stopped loving you, Jake. Please, you have to believe me. I took a step back, out of her reach, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to believe her, I wanted to believe that there was some part of her that still cared, that still loved me. But how could I? How could I believe anything she said when she had lied to me for so long? You destroyed us, Karen, I said, my voice cold and detached. You destroyed everything we had, everything we could have had. And for what? A few cheap thrills? A few moments of excitement? She shook her head, her sobs quieting as she realized the gravity of the situation. Please, Jake, please don't leave me. I'll do anything, anything to make it right. I stared at her, my heart breaking as I saw the desperation in her eyes. She was begging for a second chance, for forgiveness. But I couldn't give it to her. Not now. Not after everything she had done. It's too late, I said finally, my voice hollow. It's too late for us, Karen. You made your choices, and now you have to live with the consequences. Her face crumpled, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. Please, Jake. I love you. I don't want to lose you. But it was too late. She had already lost me, long before I had walked into that restaurant, long before I had dragged her lover into that alley. She had lost me the moment she decided that I wasn't enough, that our marriage wasn't enough. I turned away from her, unable to bear the sight of her any longer. The woman I had loved, the woman I had married, she was gone. All that was left was a shell, a hollow reminder of the life we once had. And now, that life was over. Without another word, I walked out of the room, leaving Karen to her tears. The confrontation was over, but the war was just beginning. She had destroyed our marriage, and now it was time to destroy everything she had left. After walking away from Karen that night, I spent hours driving aimlessly around the city. My thoughts were a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and the cold, hard resolve that had settled in my chest. She had begged for forgiveness, pleaded for a second chance, but I wasn't about to let her off the hook so easily. Forgiveness was out of the question. I wanted something more, something that would make her feel the pain she had inflicted on me. By the time I returned home, it was well past midnight. The house was dark and quiet, and for a moment, I stood in the driveway, staring at the front door, gathering my thoughts. I wasn't going to sleep, not tonight. I had work to do. Quietly, I let myself inside and headed straight to my office, where I spent the next several hours planning my revenge. Karen had shattered the life we built together, and I was going to do the same to her. I wasn't going to divorce her, not yet. That would be too easy. No, I wanted her to suffer first, to feel the weight of her actions crushing her from the inside out. And I knew exactly where to start. The next morning, I woke up early, despite the few hours of restless sleep I had managed to get. Karen was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in front of her, staring blankly out the window. Her eyes were red and puffy, and it was clear she hadn't slept much either. Good. She looked up as I entered the room, her expression wary, as if she was afraid to say anything that might set me off. I didn't acknowledge her as I made myself a cup of coffee. The silence between us was heavy, but I wasn't in the mood to break it. Not yet. Instead, I sat down at the table across from her, sipping my coffee slowly, watching her squirm under my gaze. She looked like she wanted to say something, to beg for forgiveness again, but she knew better than to try. Not after last night. I've been thinking, I said finally, setting my cup down and leaning back in my chair. You want to make things right? Prove it. Karen's eyes flickered with a mix of hope and fear. I'll do anything, Jake. Just tell me what I need to do. I smiled coldly, leaning forward to rest my elbows on the table. Anything, huh? We'll see about that. I pulled out a piece of paper from my pocket and slid it across the table to her. She picked it up with trembling hands, her eyes widening as she read the list I had written down. It was a list of all the things she would need to do to start making amends, a list that was as humiliating as it was demanding. You're going to quit your job, I began, my voice calm and measured. You're going to stay home, where I can keep an eye on you. No more going out with friends, no more girls' nights. Your social life is over. From now on, your life revolves around this house, and you'll do exactly what I say, when I say it. Understood? Karen looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock. Jake, Please, my job is gone, I interrupted sharply. Consider it severance for what you've done. You don't get to have a career anymore. You don't get to have a life outside of this house. You want to make things right? You do it on my terms. She swallowed hard, nodding slowly as she set the paper back down on the table. Okay, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'll quit. Good, I said, my tone cold. And that's just the beginning. You'll hand over your phone, your email passwords, and anything else I ask for. I want full access to everything. No more secrets, no more lies. You've proven you can't be trusted, so now you'll have to earn it back, if that's even possible. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't argue. She knew she didn't have a choice. I had her backed into a corner, and she was too afraid of what might happen if she pushed back. And one more thing, I added, leaning in closer. You're going to cut off all contact with everyone you cheated with. I want to see the texts, the emails, I want proof that you've ended it. And if I find out you're still in contact with any of them, there will be consequences. Karen nodded again, her hands trembling as she wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. I'll do it, Jake. I'll cut them off, I promise. I stared at her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch out between us. I could see the fear in her eyes, the realization that her life was no longer her own. And that was exactly what I wanted. I wanted her to feel trapped, to know that she had lost control of everything she held dear. Good, I said finally, standing up from the table. You have until the end of the day to take care of everything on that list. And don't think for a second that I won't be checking up on you. With that, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone with the list of demands that would soon become her new reality. But I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Over the next few days, I put my plan into action, making sure that Karen followed through on every demand I had laid out for her. I watched as she quit her job, handed over her phone, and sent messages to her so-called friends, cutting off all contact. I made sure she knew that I was watching her every move, that there was no escape from the prison she had created for herself. But it wasn't enough to just control her life, I wanted to humiliate her, to make her feel the same shame and betrayal that I had felt. And I knew exactly how to do it. I started with small things, subtle at first. I would accidentally let it slip in conversation with mutual friends that Karen wasn't feeling well, or that she was having some issues at home. I knew it would get back to her, that the whispers and rumors would start to spread. But I didn't care. This was all part of the plan. I changed the locks on the house, forcing her to ask for permission to come and go. I took away her access to our joint bank accounts, giving her a meager allowance that barely covered her basic needs. She was completely dependent on me now, and I made sure she knew it. And then, I started making her perform the most demeaning tasks around the house. Scrubbing the floors on her hands and knees, cleaning the toilets, doing the laundry, all while I sat back and watched. I didn't help, didn't offer any words of comfort. I just watched, letting her feel the full weight of her new reality. Karen's spirit was breaking, piece by piece, and I reveled in it. She had destroyed our marriage, and now I was destroying her. But the crowning moment of my revenge came a few weeks later, when I decided it was time to put Karen on display for everyone to see. We had a party planned, a small gathering with some close friends. Karen had tried to cancel it, but I insisted that we go through with it. I wanted everyone to see what she had become. The night of the party, I told Karen exactly what she was going to wear, a tight, revealing dress that left little to the imagination. She looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and fear, but she didn't argue. She knew better by now. You're going to smile, I told her coldly as I adjusted the dress on her. You're going to be the perfect hostess. And if you so much as step out of line, I will make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of woman you really are. Karen nodded, her eyes downcast as she tried to hold back tears. I could see the humiliation in her posture, the way she tried to shrink into herself. But I didn't care. This was her punishment, and she was going to take it. As our guests arrived, I watched as Karen forced herself to smile, to play the role of the doting wife. But there was a desperation in her eyes, a silent plea for mercy that she knew would never come. I introduced her to our friends, made her pour drinks and serve appetizers, all while making subtle comments that hinted at the tension between us. I wanted everyone to see the cracks in our marriage, to wonder what was really going on behind closed doors. By the end of the night, Karen was barely holding it together. She was exhausted, emotionally and physically, but I wasn't done yet. As the last of our guests left, I cornered her in the kitchen, my voice low and menacing. "You did well tonight," I said, my tone devoid of any warmth. "But don't think for a second that this means you're off the hook. This is your life now, Karen. This is what you deserve." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and despair. "Jake, please. I've done everything you asked, isn't that enough?" "Enough?" I repeated, a cold smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "We're just getting started, Karen. You're going to spend the rest of your life making up for what you've done. And I'm going to make sure you never forget it." Karen's shoulders sagged as the full weight of my words sank in. She was trapped, and she knew it. There was no escape from the nightmare she had created, no way out of the hell she was living in. And that was exactly how I wanted it. After bringing Karen to heel, I turned my attention to Tom, the man who had dared to step into my life and destroy my marriage. I had already beaten him to a pulp in that alley behind the restaurant, but that wasn't enough. I needed to make sure he understood the full extent of what he had done, that his life was as ruined as the one he had tried to ruin. The first step was finding out everything I could about him. I spent hours digging through his social media profiles, piecing together the details of his life. He wasn't hard to track, like most people these days, he shared far too much online. I learned where he worked, who his friends were, even where he liked to hang out on the weekends. He had a girlfriend, too, a sweet-looking blonde named Emily, who had no idea what kind of man she was dating. It was almost too easy. All the pieces fell into place, one after the other, until I had everything I needed to make Tom's life a living hell. The first thing I did was reach out to Emily. I created a fake social media account, using a profile picture of an attractive woman I found online. I made sure to craft a believable backstory, just another girl who had met Tom at a party and thought he was cute. I sent her a friend request, and within a day, she had accepted. From there, it was just a matter of striking up a conversation. I started small, commenting on her photos, liking her posts. She was friendly, open, and trusting, everything I needed her to be. After a few days of casual chatting, I dropped the bombshell. "You know, it's really weird," I messaged her one evening, "but I think I know your boyfriend. Tom, right?" Her response was immediate. "Yeah. How do you know him?" I smiled to myself, my fingers flying over the keyboard as I typed out the lie. "I'm not sure how to say this, but I think he might be cheating on you. I saw him with another woman the other day. They were all over each other." The silence on her end was palpable. I could almost feel the shock radiating through the screen. After a few moments, she responded, her tone hesitant and disbelieving. "Are you sure? Tom wouldn't do that." I pretended to hesitate, as if I was torn about whether to continue. I didn't want to believe it either, but, yeah, I'm sure. I even took a picture because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The trap was set, and she walked right into it. "Can you send it to me?" I didn't hesitate. I had already prepared a photo, one I had doctored to look like Tom and Karen were kissing. It wasn't perfect, but it was good enough to convince someone who was already questioning her boyfriend's loyalty. I sent it to Emily, and then I waited. It didn't take long for her to respond. Her messages came in a flurry, filled with disbelief, anger, and heartbreak. She demanded to know who the woman was, where I had seen them, when it had happened. I fed her just enough information to keep her on the hook, watching as her world began to unravel. "Do you think I should confront him?" she asked finally, her messages tinged with desperation. "Honestly," I replied, I would. He needs to know that he can't just get away with this. She thanked me profusely, saying she was going to talk to him that night. I knew she would. I knew she would storm into his apartment, phone in hand, demanding answers. And I knew that Tom, being the coward he was, would stumble over his words, trying to lie his way out of it. But it wouldn't work. The seed of doubt had been planted, and there was no way he could talk his way out of it. But that was just the beginning. A few days later, I called Tom's workplace. I had found out where he worked, an advertising agency in the city, and I knew exactly how to make sure his career went up in flames. I used a burner phone, disguising my voice as I spoke to his boss. "Hi, I'm calling because I think you should know what kind of person you have working for you," I began, my tone calm and measured. "There's a man in your office, Tom, last name, who's been engaging in some very inappropriate behavior. I have evidence that he's been using company resources to facilitate an affair. I think it's something you'd want to be aware of." The boss, predictably, was shocked. I could hear the concern in his voice as he asked for more details. I played the part of the concerned citizen perfectly, explaining how I had come across emails that were sent from Tom's work account, how I had seen him meeting with a woman during work hours, how I suspected he was using company time for personal rendezvous. I made sure to drop enough details to make it seem credible, without giving too much away. By the time the call was over, I knew I had planted enough doubt in the boss's mind to spark an investigation. It was only a matter of time before they pulled Tom into the office, questioned him, and eventually decided that he was more trouble than he was worth. His career was about to take a nosedive, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. The next part of my plan was the most satisfying. I found out where Tom's parents lived, an older couple in their 60s, who had no idea what their son had been up to. I wrote a letter, carefully crafting every word to ensure it hit the right notes. I detailed Tom's affair with Karen, how he had destroyed my marriage, how he was a lying, cheating scumbag who didn't deserve their love or support. I mailed the letter anonymously, knowing that it would arrive in a few days, and that Tom would be faced with the fallout from his own family. I wanted his parents to see him for who he really was, to feel the same disappointment and betrayal that I felt every time I looked at Karen. As the days passed, I kept an eye on Tom, watching as his life began to crumble. Emily broke up with him, of course. She was heartbroken, angry, and she made sure everyone knew what kind of man Tom was. She posted about it on social media, tagging him in every post, dragging his name through the mud. His friends, those same people he had bragged to about his conquests, started to distance themselves, not wanting to be associated with someone who was quickly becoming a pariah. At work, things were no better. I heard through the grapevine that Tom had been put on probation, his boss citing inappropriate conduct as the reason. It was only a matter of time before they fired him, and when that day came, I knew it would be the final nail in the coffin of his career. But the real satisfaction came when I received an email, a frantic, desperate message from Tom himself. He had found out who I was, of course. He wasn't stupid, and he had pieced together that I was behind the string of events that had destroyed his life. He begged me to stop, pleaded for me to leave him alone, claimed he was sorry for what he had done. I read the email twice, a smile spreading across my face as I absorbed every word. He was broken, defeated, just like I had wanted him to be. He had lost everything, his girlfriend, his job, his friends, and soon, his family. He had nothing left, and it was all because of me. I didn't respond to his email. I didn't need to. I had already won. I knew that every day, every hour, Tom would be looking over his shoulder, wondering what was going to happen next. He would never know peace again, never be able to relax, always waiting for the next blow to fall. And that was enough. I had taken everything from him, just like he had taken everything from me. And as far as I was concerned, he deserved every bit of it. The days after my revenge on Tom passed in a blur. The satisfaction I'd felt from destroying his life slowly began to fade, replaced by a cold emptiness. The thrill of revenge had been sweet, but it wasn't enough. I was left with the same question that had haunted me from the beginning: what was I supposed to do now? Karen had tried her best to comply with my demands, but the cracks were showing. She was a shell of the woman she used to be, anxious, withdrawn, and constantly on edge. The power I had over her was intoxicating, but it wasn't bringing me the peace I had hoped for. Every time I looked at her, I was reminded of the betrayal, of the countless lies, and the wreckage of the life we had built together. The more I tried to control her, the more I realized that this wasn't the life I wanted anymore. I knew what I had to do. The thought of divorce had lingered in the back of my mind for weeks, but I had pushed it aside, telling myself I wasn't ready. But the truth was, I would never be ready. There was no fixing what was broken between us. The marriage we once had was dead, and I needed to bury it for good. I quietly started the process of filing for divorce, making sure to keep it under wraps. I wanted it to be a surprise, a final blow that would leave no doubt in Karen's mind that we were done. I met with my lawyer in secret, going over the details, making sure everything was in place before I made my move. A few days later, the papers were ready. I picked them up from my lawyer's office, the weight of the documents heavy in my hands. It felt like I was holding the end of my marriage, the final nail in the coffin. But there was a strange sense of relief that came with it, too. This was the closure I needed, the end of the chapter that had caused me so much pain. I drove home, the divorce papers sitting in the passenger seat, taunting me with their finality. My heart pounded in my chest as I thought about how this would all play out, how Karen would react when she realized what was happening. I knew it wasn't going to be pretty, but it had to be done. When I got home, Karen was in the kitchen, making dinner. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of apprehension and hope. For a moment, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to hold off, to delay the inevitable. But I knew better. There was no point in prolonging the agony. It was time to end this once and for all. Karen, I said, my voice steady but firm. We need to talk. She froze, the knife in her hand hovering over the cutting board. I could see the fear in her eyes, the realization that something was wrong. She set the knife down slowly, wiping her hands on a towel as she turned to face me. What is it, Jake? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope containing the divorce papers. I held it out to her, watching as her face went pale, her eyes widening with shock. What is this? She stammered, her hands shaking as she took the envelope from me. Open it, I said, my tone emotionless. She fumbled with the envelope, tearing it open with trembling fingers. As she pulled out the papers and started to read, I could see the color drain from her face. Her eyes darted across the page, the reality of what was happening slowly sinking in. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible. No, Jake, please, don't do this. It's already done, I replied coldly. The papers are filed. This is happening, Karen. It's over. She looked up at me, tears welling up in her eyes. But we can work through this, Jake. We can fix this. I can change. I shook my head, cutting her off. There's nothing left to fix, Karen. You destroyed us. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them. This marriage is over. Her tears started to fall, rolling down her cheeks as she clutched the papers to her chest. Please, Jake. I'm begging you, don't do this. I'll do anything. I'm done, Karen, I said, my voice hardening. I'm done with the lies, the betrayal, all of it. There's no going back from this. The papers are filed, and you've been served. The court date is set. It's time to move on. She broke down, collapsing into a chair as sobs racked her body. The sound of her crying filled the room, but I felt nothing. No sympathy, no guilt, no remorse. I had given her every chance to make things right, to salvage what little was left of our marriage. But she had thrown it all away, and now she was facing the consequences. For a long time, I stood there, watching her cry, letting the reality of the situation sink in. This was it, the end of the road. There was no turning back now. The life we had built together was gone, and all that was left was the cold, hard truth that we were better off apart. Eventually, Karen's sobs quieted, her breathing ragged as she tried to compose herself. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen, her face streaked with tears. "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked, her voice weak and broken. "You'll figure it out," I replied, my tone indifferent. "You always do." She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine for any sign of compassion, any hint that I might change my mind. But she found nothing. I was done with her, done with this marriage, done with the pain. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Karen alone with the divorce papers. As I made my way to the bedroom, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. It was finally over. The decision had been made, and there was no going back. I closed the door behind me, leaning against it for a moment as I let out a deep breath. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one that didn't include Karen or the pain she had caused. It was time to move on, to start rebuilding my life from the ashes of the one she had destroyed. And I was ready for it. The weeks leading up to the court date were filled with an uneasy silence between Karen and me. She had stopped trying to plead her case, stopped begging for forgiveness. Instead, she retreated into herself, barely speaking, her movements around the house mechanical and devoid of life. It was as if she was already mourning the death of our marriage, accepting the inevitable. I didn't engage with her, didn't try to console or comfort her. We were simply two people living under the same roof, waiting for the final chapter of our life together to be written. When the court date finally arrived, the tension in the house was palpable. I woke up early that morning, the weight of the day pressing down on me like a lead blanket. As I got dressed in the suit I had picked out the night before, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions, relief that this nightmare was almost over, and a hollow sadness that things had come to this. Karen and I drove to the courthouse separately. I didn't want to share a car with her, didn't want to spend even a second longer than necessary in her presence. As I pulled into the parking lot and made my way inside, I spotted her walking up the steps, her head bowed, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked defeated, and for a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The courtroom was a stark, impersonal place, filled with the quiet murmurs of people waiting for their cases to be heard. I found a seat near the front, scanning the room as I waited for our turn. Karen entered a few minutes later, her eyes avoiding mine as she took a seat on the opposite side of the room. She was dressed simply, her makeup minimal, and her expression blank. It was a far cry from the confident, vibrant woman I had once known. Our lawyers were there, of course, mine a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had guided me through the divorce process with precision, and Karen's a middle-aged man who looked like he had seen one too many cases like ours. They exchanged a few words as we waited, both of them professionals who knew the routine all too well. When the judge finally called our case, I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest as I made my way to the front of the courtroom. Karen followed, her movements stiff and hesitant. We stood before the judge, our lawyers on either side of us, as the proceedings began. The judge, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes, flipped through the file in front of her, her expression unreadable. She looked up at us, her gaze lingering on Karen for a moment before she spoke. "Mr. and Mrs., your last name, I understand you are here today to finalize your divorce," she said, her tone matter of fact. "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, my voice steady. Karen nodded, her eyes downcast. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge glanced at the papers in front of her, then back at us. "I see that you have reached a settlement regarding the division of assets and other relevant matters. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," my lawyer confirmed, stepping forward slightly. "The terms have been agreed upon by both parties." The judge nodded, making a note in the file. "And there are no children involved in this case?" "That's correct, Your Honor," Karen's lawyer said, his voice flat. The judge looked at us again, her expression softening slightly as she addressed Karen. Mrs., your last name, do you understand the terms of this settlement? Do you agree to them? Karen hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Yes, Your Honor, she whispered, her voice barely audible. And you, Mr., your last name? The judge asked, turning her attention to me. Yes, Your Honor, I replied firmly. The judge took a deep breath, her gaze shifting between the two of us. Divorce is never an easy process, she said, her tone softening. But I see that you have both taken the necessary steps to resolve this matter amicably. I will grant the divorce based on the terms outlined in the settlement. There was a brief silence as the judge signed the final papers, her pen scratching against the paper the only sound in the room. When she finished, she looked up at us one last time. The marriage between Mr. and Mrs., your last name, is hereby dissolved, she declared, her voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. You are both free to go. And just like that, it was over. The marriage that had once been the center of my life was now officially dead, reduced to a few lines of legal jargon in a court document. I felt a strange sense of detachment as I watched the judge hand the papers to the bailiff, who in turn passed them to our lawyers. Karen's lawyer stepped back, gently guiding her away from the bench as he spoke to her in low tones. I didn't pay attention to what he was saying, I was too focused on the finality of the moment. The woman I had once loved, the woman who had betrayed me, was now nothing more than a figure from my past. Our lives, once intertwined, were now separate, our futures headed in different directions. As I turned to leave the courtroom, I caught a glimpse of Karen out of the corner of my eye. She was standing with her lawyer, clutching the divorce papers in her hands, her eyes vacant. She looked lost, like someone who had just woken up from a nightmare only to realize it was real. For a moment, I felt a pang of something, pity, maybe, or regret, but I pushed it aside. This was what needed to happen. There was no room for second thoughts, no room for looking back. We were done, and it was time to move on. I walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, taking a deep breath as I stepped outside. The air felt different, lighter somehow, as if the weight I had been carrying for so long had finally been lifted. I stood there for a moment, letting the reality of my new life sink in. The court had spoken, the marriage was over, and I was free. I didn't wait for Karen. I didn't look back to see if she was following. Instead, I walked to my car, each step a little easier than the last. I opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, and sat there for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel. This was it, the beginning of a new chapter. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know what challenges or opportunities lay ahead. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of hope, a sense of possibility. The past was behind me, and now it was time to start building something new, something better. I started the car, the engine purring to life beneath me. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced back at the courthouse one last time, a final farewell to the life I was leaving behind. And then I drove away, ready to face whatever came next. The first few days after the divorce were surreal. It was as if I was floating through life, detached from everything around me. The house felt emptier, quieter, even though Karen had yet to move out. We avoided each other, existing in the same space but living entirely separate lives. It was like being in limbo, caught between the remnants of the past and the uncertain future ahead. But as the days turned into weeks, something began to shift inside me. The numbness that had settled in my chest slowly gave way to a sense of clarity, a realization that I was finally free. Free from the lies, the betrayal, and the constant tension that had plagued my life for so long. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. I started making changes, small at first, but significant. The house, once a place filled with memories both good and bad, needed to be transformed into a space that was mine. I began by clearing out the clutter, getting rid of anything that reminded me of the life Karen and I had shared. Photos, old mementos, gifts we had given each other over the years, they all went into boxes, destined for storage or the trash. It was cathartic, in a way. Each item I removed felt like I was shedding another layer of the past, making room for something new. I repainted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and even bought a few new pieces that reflected the person I was becoming. The house was slowly transforming, just as I was. As Karen's departure loomed closer, I found myself spending more time outside, reconnecting with old friends and rediscovering interests I had neglected during my marriage. I joined a local running group, something I hadn't done since college, and it felt good to push my body to its limits again, to feel the burn in my muscles and the rush of endorphins. It was a reminder that I was still capable of growth, still capable of finding joy in the simple things. My social circle expanded as well. Friends I hadn't seen in years reached out, offering support and companionship. We started meeting up for drinks, dinners, and weekend activities, filling the void that had been left by the collapse of my marriage. It was strange at first, stepping back into a world I had been absent from for so long, but it was also exhilarating. I was rediscovering parts of myself that I had forgotten, and it felt good, really good. One evening, as I was sitting at a bar with a group of friends, I found myself in a deep conversation with a woman named Sarah. She was someone I had met through the running group, and we had clicked almost instantly. Sarah was smart, funny, and incredibly down-to-earth, with a quick wit that matched my own. We had started spending more time together, and I found myself looking forward to our conversations, our shared runs, and the easy camaraderie that had developed between us. That night, as we laughed over drinks and shared stories about our lives, I realized that I was genuinely happy. It wasn't the forced, fragile happiness I had clung to during my marriage, it was real, solid, and rooted in the present moment. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about the past or worrying about the future. I was simply enjoying the company of someone who made me feel alive. As the night wore on, the conversation turned more personal. Sarah asked me about the divorce, about how I was coping with everything. I hesitated at first, unsure if I wanted to open up, but something about her presence made it easy to talk. I told her about the betrayal, the anger, the overwhelming sense of loss that had consumed me. And as I spoke, I realized that the pain, while still there, was beginning to fade. "Sounds like you've been through a lot," Sarah said softly, her eyes reflecting genuine empathy. "But you're coming out the other side. You're stronger than you think." I nodded, taking a sip of my drink. "Yeah, I guess I am. It's been a rough road, but I'm starting to feel like myself again. Like maybe this whole mess was a blessing in disguise." She smiled, reaching out to place a hand on mine. "You're not alone, Jake. We've all got our baggage, but it's what we do with it that counts." Her touch was warm, comforting, and for a moment, I let myself imagine what it might be like to move on, to let go of the past completely and open myself up to something new. It was a terrifying thought, but also an exciting one. There was a whole world out there, full of possibilities I had never considered. And for the first time, I felt ready to explore it. As the weeks went by, Sarah and I continued to grow closer. Our friendship deepened, and I found myself looking forward to our time together more and more. It wasn't just about running or grabbing drinks, it was about the connection we were building, the trust that was forming between us. There was a lightness to our interactions, a sense of ease that I hadn't felt in a long time. Karen eventually moved out, taking the last of her things with her. There was no grand goodbye, no dramatic final confrontation. She simply packed up and left, leaving behind a key and a note on the kitchen counter. The note was brief, just a few lines thanking me for everything we had shared and wishing me well in the future. I read it once, then folded it up and put it away. There was no need to dwell on it. The chapter was closed. With Karen gone, the house felt even more like mine. I embraced the solitude, using the time to focus on myself, on healing, and on building the life I wanted. I took up new hobbies, started cooking more, and even began planning a trip, a solo adventure to a place I had always wanted to visit but never had the chance. It was liberating to make decisions based solely on what I wanted, without having to consider anyone else's needs or desires. One afternoon, as I was packing for the trip, Sarah stopped by. She had brought a bottle of wine, a spontaneous gift to celebrate my upcoming adventure. We sat on the porch, sipping wine and talking about the places I would visit, the things I would see. The conversation was easy, flowing naturally from one topic to the next, and before I knew it, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over everything. "Jake," Sarah said after a while, her voice soft, "I'm really glad we met. You've become an important part of my life." I looked at her, the sincerity in her eyes making my heart skip a beat. "I feel the same way," I admitted, setting my glass down. "You've been a big part of what's helped me get through all of this." She smiled, her eyes locking with mine. There was a moment of silence, heavy with unspoken words, before she leaned in and kissed me. It was a gentle, tentative kiss, one that spoke of new beginnings and the promise of something more. I kissed her back, my heart pounding, the warmth of her lips igniting something inside me that I hadn't felt in a long time. When we finally pulled away, Sarah smiled, her cheeks flushed. "Maybe this trip will be the start of something new," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it will," I agreed, my own voice tinged with hope. As we sat there, the world around us fading into the background, I realized that this was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when the past finally let go of its hold on me, and the future opened up, full of endless possibilities. Life after Karen wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving, about rediscovering who I was and what I wanted. It was about finding joy in the little things, in the people who mattered, and in the freedom that came from living life on my own terms. The journey had been long and painful, but as I sat there with Sarah, the sunset casting a golden light over us, I knew that I had come out the other side stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. This was my new life, and I was ready to live it to the fullest.